remains above 10%, the highest rate of any G7 country at the moment. Ministers plan to create new safe and legal routes for asylum seekers, which would allow 20,000 to come here next year. Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer traded blows about tackling crime following those Labour attack adverts. And the Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police has told LBC that no police force across the country is institutionally racist. Well, there you go. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to ask our panel a question. And on the panel today, Dame Angela Eagle to my left, Labour MP for Wallasey and a former Treasury Minister. Sitting next to her, Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP for Bournemouth East, who's the Chairman of the Defence Select Committee. To my right, Whelan, journalist and commentator, who's a columnist for Spike Online. And to her right, Greg Dyke, the former Director General of the BBC and former Chairman of the Football Association. You can also send a question in by text on 84850 or say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And don't forget to watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Let's go to our first caller. It's Stephen in East Grinstead. Hi, Stephen.
Hi, good evening, Iain. Good evening, panel. Will protest groups like Extinction Rebellion give the Met Police and security staff the runaround at Sunday's London Marathon? Or do you trust that the police know how to respond to them better now?
We've just spent the last hour talking about protests that might happen at the King's coronation, so maybe we can bring that into it too. Tobias, well, let's come to you first on this. Obviously, the right to protest is ingrained in any democratic society, but some people have tired of the kind of protest that Just Oil and Extinction Rebellion are bringing about and accuse the police of being too soft. What do you think?
Yeah, it's absolutely right. It is that right to protest, and we do that, I think, well in the UK. Where we're going to here, though, is that these very people may be promoting and supporting an absolutely worthy cause, which many of us would agree with, but they alienate the very people when they disrupt things like the marathon or the Grand National or indeed the coronation. Don't forget, these are internationally watched events. Around the world, people will be looking at Britain. So, we're on display, if you like. And to see these events disrupted in this manner, I think it will actually turn people off wanting to support Extinction Rebellion. I suspect if it continues in this way, you're going to get harsher penalties being called for by the British public as well. This isn't the way to go about demonstrations. This is taking advantage, I think, of our very, very open society in the way we go about doing things. So I hope they will reconsider in how that they can best affect and influence the people like us around the decision makers around this table, the government as well, because by doing so at the moment, this approach, they will alienate I think members of Parliament and indeed the British public.
Can I just test you out on something? Because last night we had a Conservative and a Labour MP on, and neither of them had ever been asked for an appointment by a member of Extinction Rebellion or Just Oil.
Yeah.
Have you?
No, never. Well, never whatsoever. And that's very, very interesting indeed, particularly, as I say, that there are many of us that want to see this shared green agenda of where we want to go to push Britain to be at the forefront of recognising the challenges that we face from a climate change perspective. I say this as chair of the Defence Committee. We're doing some studies on this. The biggest fundamental challenge that our world faces is climate change. And it's going to come up. It's not the next generation, it's our generation that needs to start thinking and answering the very, very difficult questions.
But they would say, but you're not doing it. That's why we have to protest.
The way that they're going about it is actually taking away from asking the difficult questions about this. And it's more than about what happens at the marathon. It's more than what happens at the coronation. That is going to be the headlines around the world, not what we're doing about climate change.
Angela.
Well, I think I agree that Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, do things that get them vast amounts of publicity with minimum effort. And coming to see us in our advice surgery would take more organisation. And so I think we have to think about the coverage that people get for doing stuff like that. I think they're absolutely...
Do you think we in the media fall into their traps?
To some extent. I mean, obviously you have to cover the news, but I think it's extremely unfair to disrupt a sporting event, particularly, for example, like a marathon. You can't restart it. and it's particularly unfair to do that with global events. However, I have total sympathy with the cause that they're talking about. We are entering a stage now with climate change where if we don't make very, very, very rapid change very, very quickly, we are going to get well beyond the increases in temperatures that make life livable on the earth. And that I can't think of anything that's more important than that. So I think that we need a proper grown-up national, international conversation about how we make drastic change now really, really quickly. The evidence for climate change is all around. We're on a catastrophic path at the moment for the future of life on Earth. We are in the 6th great extinction of life on this Earth. That's going on around us now. All the signs are everywhere, and we really, really need to do something very drastic about it. And the government is opening new oil wells. They're talking about opening a coal mine in the country. It's all about what you do to stop that stuff getting into the atmosphere, and so far we're not doing nearly enough. So I have sympathy with the cause, but I don't have sympathy with them gluing themselves to very important paintings or ruining the marathon.
And the government would say, of course, that Britain has reduced its carbon emissions more than any other European country. I think I'm right, apart from Sweden.
But they've also announced that they're going to now take more oil from the North Sea, and they're going to reopen a coal mine. So, I think that we've got to get real. We've got to talk about developing green energy very, very rapidly. We've got to put a lot more money into looking to see what we can do about clean energy, and doing a lot more scientific work on what we can do to get carbon out of the atmosphere and solve this problem, which is going to probably affect me in my life more than perhaps a lot of people my age think. And certainly the next generation are going to have a serious, serious problem with it.
Whelan.
Well, maybe we're misunderstanding what Extinction Rebellion stands for. I mean, because it's unsurprising that both sides of the House say that they're completely in agreement with what Extinction Rebellion are about. I mean, Angela, if you really thought that we were all going extinct, and that, like Extinction Rebellion says, we have to stop all activity doing anything that has any effect on the planet now, or we'll all die, then I can imagine you probably would, wouldn't you want to be gluing yourself to the road rather than queuing up for a surgery if you really thought it was that serious? I think it's very fortuitous for politicians at the moment to have a group like Extinction Rebellion around about the place saying, you're giving them the excuse for not doing anything, saying that growth is bad, saying that anything relating to getting more energy sources is bad, that, doing things as sort of fundamental as having people be able to heat their homes, cook dinner for a reasonable price, which does involve, expending some energy, using some of the fuel sources that we have at the moment, fossil fuels, as sort of evil as they've been painted, getting people a good quality of ensuring a good quality of life for people in this country hang on a minute, it really
isn't a question of being evil.
It is the way in which the way in which fossil fuels and sort of and oil and coal is talked about is everybody no one's. I'm not here sucking on an exhaust pipe saying that the energy sources we have at the moment are perfect, but there is this kind of demonisation of energy in and of itself, of kind of securing it, other than unless you preface it with the word green. But to come back to the original question about the police, I mean, we don't, from accusations of institutional this, that and the other, to the fact that most police forces at the moment seem inherently disorganised. I don't think anyone has trust in them to do anything, but they should, because this government has instituted some of the most extraordinary crackdowns on protest. I mean, really, police officers now can get involved and shut down protests if they're too noisy. They can shut down protests, and ministers can decide to change the remit for what protest is allowed on a whim, without any kind of, without any debate or anything like that. So if they can't stop Extinction Rebellion, then we're in pretty dire states, because it's becoming almost impossible in the current moment to protest about anything freely. And And as much as I think that Extinction Rebellion are fruitcakes, that actually they have no respect for democracy themselves. They said from the very beginning, we're not interested in winning over a kind of democratic mandate for this. We're not interested in surgeries. We're not interested in what the public thinks. We want to see what we want done. But I still think that freedom of protest is the most important thing, and you have to think about it in the abstract. It's not just for protests you like. And actually, having disrupted a few things in my time, there's nothing like. Well, I mean, I never stood in front of a marathon or in front of a horse or anything like that. But
what have you disrupted?
But I think there was around Brexit. I did a few public stunts and things like that. Maybe I sat in the road somewhere. But there's
maybe. But you can't actually remember.
I'm not going to let on unless there's any coppers listening. I'm not going to let on. But there's, in the abstract, the freedom of protest. Even you have to defend it for the people you loathe as well as the people you love.
Greg Dyke.
Well, the question was about the police, really. And could the police stop protests against the marathon? I would think that's very difficult. I mean, you're running for 26 miles. How do you haven't got enough policemen in London to cover the whole of the 26 miles. And I say that as someone who is, I would basically believe there's a need to reform the whole of the police structure of the police in this country, and has been for a long time. And that they're pretty good at survival, actually, the existing structures, and the last Labour government thought about it and backed off in the end. But I do think
it's one of the only public services that Margaret Thatcher stayed away from as well.
Yeah, no. But if you're taking out and it would be a great shame if they disrupted the marathon, because most of the people running there are running to raise vast sums of money for charity, and it would be terrible if it was disrupted. I've got a horrible feeling that we all recognise the seriousness of what is happening in terms of the climate change, and we'll all do something, but we'll only do enough. We probably won't do enough as individuals.
Well, there is nothing that we as individuals can do that would mitigate what is happening in China and India and Brazil and all of the BRIC countries.
That's not a case for not doing it.
No, I'm not saying it is, but that's the challenge. And this is what I don't understand about why they don't come and lobby politicians like Tobias and Angela, because in the end, nothing's going to get done unless politicians from each country sit around a table and agree it, and that they do it at these COP summits, and they come to sort of worthy agreements, but which don't quite go far enough, because the main countries that are the main polluters of the world don't actually either sit around the table, or if they do, they don't really do much in response.
I think you touched on something that is so important. I mean, firstly, the bit about the transition, absolutely we want to go there, but the idea that you just switch off using, the current fossil fuels will cause absolute chaos in this country, and then lead to far more pandemonium that we'd get.
The kind of net zero promises that your government has made will mean ridiculous and catastrophic change for people's individual lives.
Quite rightly, let's debate those, and then let's advance them far faster. But the idea that you're saying...
I've never had the chance to debate them.
If I can finish.
It's a complete
Extinction Rebellion wants us to stop this straight away today, and as we're seeing with energy prices and so forth, it would cause absolute pandemonium to the British economy and our ability to build a function. But the bigger picture I wanted to come back to on Iain, that you touched on, which I think is so important, is Britain's international communing power, which we've lost sight of, as us as a leader in the world, being able to rally other nations to our cause. We've lost sight of that capability. It's something that we've been strong on over decades, arguably centuries as well. And in the last 5 or 6 years, we've taken a back seat on the international stage, starting to regroup. COP26 was a great example of that. But that's where we should be lobbied. That's where we should be rallied. And then we can together, supported by the United States and others, have a tackle at China and India and other countries who are those huge polluters.
Anthony has sent in a text saying, Mr. Dale, do you not listen to LBC radio? I'm sure that Extinction Rebellion were interviewed earlier, not on my programme they weren't, and a spokesperson said they'd been talking to the London Marathon organisers for a year plus and had no intention of disrupting this year's event. Tobias Ellwood's predictable comments is a cheap shot from Angela Eagle. Well, there you go. We'll move on to something else in just a moment. You're listening to LBC's Cross Question. It's 8:15.
LBC.
Reintroduce my panel if you've just joined us. Dame Angela Eagle, Labour MP, Tobias Ellwood, Conservative MP, Greg Dyke, former Director General of the BBC, and Ella Whelan, journalist and commentator and columnist for Spiked Online. Our next question comes from Paul in Deal via a text. He says, for the second month running, the economic experts who had predicted what the inflation figure would be were way off. Are they really worth listening to anymore? I don't know whether Paul in Deal is a pseudonym for Michael Gove, who once said we shouldn't be listening to economic experts,
or any experts,
or
I seem to remember.
No, I think it was. He did. To be fair, he did just say economic experts, but I think that's been sort of exaggerated a bit. Angela, why do economists get it consistently wrong?
Well, because they can't predict the exact future, and they're making guesses. I think if you look at what was expected of today's inflation figures, they thought inflation was going to fall more than it did, which shows that we've got a stickier problem. If you look in the G7, we've got the largest level of inflation, and if you actually look behind the figures, the most worrying bit, if anything, is that the food inflation is now 19%. And I think it's about time that the government started looking at the what's known as price gouging, if you're an economist, but is actually profiteering, price profiteering in a position where inflation is going up. Why is food inflation that high? It's much higher than in other countries. I think Brexit might have had something to do with it. I think there's worker shortages, supply problems. But is there also profiteering going on as well? And I don't think the government's paying enough attention to what's actually going on with this. We know inflation will drop considerably next month because the energy price rises will fall out. That's a mathematical certainty. But beyond that, I don't think we can say a lot.
How much is the Governor of the Bank of England responsible for this? Because their remit is for inflation to be 2%, and he has to explain why it isn't.
Yes.
Andrew Bailey does seem to have a pretty hapless record so far.
Well, I think the Bank of England would say that they are increasing interest rates, which is increasing costs for everybody and putting a huge squeeze on our economy, which grew by 0.0%, I think the last look was, in order to try and squeeze inflation out. And there will be some effect on that. But I think that when you look at it, we're in a worse position. We've got a high inflation, low growth economy. Growth has slowed in a secular way down to about 1% a year instead of the 2% that we used to get when we were last in government. And I think that we've got to look at the last bit. I think we've got to look at some economic issues about how we retool our economy. I think we've got to look at how we deal with, for example, the extra price of gas that we're particularly prone to in this country because we didn't do the insulation of homes and we didn't do the onshore wind farms and all of those things that we could have done. So I think there's been a series of policy mistakes. There's a very esoteric issue on the Bank of England, which the Treasury Select Committee is looking at the moment, which is it anything to do with quantitative easing? And there are various theories about that, which I won't go into at the moment. But clearly, the Bank of England only really has one policy tool, and that's the interest rate. And the interest rate's been very low, is now, in real terms, high and causing real problems for the cost of living.
On QE, if you learn your economics, and I got grade E at A level, so don't trust me on anything.
Did they not do QE at A level?
They did, and one thing I learned was that if you do too much QE, automatically inflation follows. There might be a time lag, but it does follow. Well, asset price
inflation often because of what the banks...
I wonder whether that is what we're seeing now. Greg Dyke.
Well, I think the interesting thing about today's figures is not that they're not what they thought they would be, but it's the size in which they are. If you were a doctor today or a nurse, or all these people who are protesting about how much their wages have actually fallen over a number of years, you'd say, "Yeah, look, we told you so." It's still 10%, and
because a lot of them have accepted 5% on the premise that inflation would be coming down.
Yeah, but 5% means you lost 5% this year of your wages, but effectively now, at a time, particularly when food prices are going so high, the people who are suffering the most, obviously, are the poorest people in society, because energy and food takes up a disproportionate amount of their money. So we are in a terribly serious problem. I was reading today that something like 30% now are in debt to their energy company. They just can't pay the bills. And I think a lot of people are just going to say, I'm not paying this, I can't do it, how do I pay? But I think for public sector workers who've had this erosion of the value of what they do over 10, 15 years, but particularly in the last 2 years, I can't see any way the government stops the whole protest and the whole and the strike action unless they discuss how do you increase, not just give them inflation, but how do you increase and take them back to where they were over a period of time. But there doesn't seem to be any debate or discussion going on, really.
Ella.
Well, I mean, the thing about announcements about inflation is that actually it's a bit like reading tea leaves at the moment. It's, and about as accurate and about as useful, because everybody wants to talk about inflation and tinkering with this or that, whether it's a government's obsession with tax, or, basically just sort of moving little bits of the chessboard here or there, and no one wants to talk about the bigger causes, which would involve big ideas. So, for example, I mean, like you said, Ian, pumping money in without anything really going on, which is what happened for years during the pandemic, is obviously going to have had an effect. It has had an effect. We've seen the lag, and here it is. And yet the consequences of lockdowns for not just for social life but also for economic life is something that politicians just have complete amnesia about at the moment. It's just not talked about anymore. I know we're all sick of COVID, but in terms of looking at how and why, at least in part, we got to the current crisis that we're in at the moment, cost of living crisis, that seems to me like a pretty big thing that we should be
But other
addressing.
countries went through the pandemic as well and locked down just as we did, and yet our inflation seems to be higher than theirs.
Which is why the more important thing, that I think talking about lockdowns is important, but more important is the grand ill health of the British economy, which goes back years and decades. And not to kind of sound like a broken record, but the conversation that we just had previously about a kind of, a narrative, a politics that is shaped by a narrative of obsession with green and environmentalism, the kind of motto of the day being do less rather than do more. Than this government nor the Labour Party have any grand plans for anything in the realm of the G word, growth, that Liz Truss has sort of sullied forever, but taking seriously the idea of actually bettering people's living standards by creating more jobs, doing something big and exciting with the economy. I'm not an economist, can't tell you what the plan is, but something it isn't untrue. There is nothing. There is we've had a rolling series of crises. If you look at how people, the average working class person's life in this country has either not changed in the last 20 years or gotten markedly worse. And that is because you've had a British economy that is not just sluggish but constantly failing, and politicians with all rosettes only talking about tinkering around the edges. There has been no kind of vision, no big idea in relation to the economy. And the reason why I mentioned Liz Truss was, as terrible as her announcement and her plans were, at least she got the label right. I mean, at least the word growth inspired some.
Sorry, she was a catastrophe, and she cost 60 billion with her mini budget.
She didn't actually. That figure has been disproved.
But there was also, let's come into it. There was a big idea. It was called Brexit. And Brexit has somehow disappeared. With the pandemic, it got muddled up, and no one knows. We don't know the impact of Brexit on inflation.
We do know that the government
prices and the rest of it. And actually, those of us who were vehemently against Brexit,
we do.
I think now know that we're being proved to be right.
But very few politicians. One at a time.
We know some of the costs. I think it's the LSE have just done a report that Brexit added 6 billion to food bills because of the extra costs there. There's worker shortages because lots of fruit rotting in the fields. We've got Brexit supply problems getting over the border. Our trade has collapsed by 15%. The Office for Budget Responsibility have said that Brexit is costing us 4% of GDP, which is double the amount that the COVID pandemic cost. So there's increasing evidence about the costs of Brexit that'll have to be addressed by future governments.
Hang on a second, Tobias. We haven't heard from Tobias yet.
Well, thank you. and absolutely, these are these three biggies that we've just summarised that have affected our economy. I'm pleased to see us finally addressing this issue of Brexit. Most people don't know that the Trading Cooperation Agreement, to give it its full name, comes up for a formal review in about 18 months' time. We have to decide whether what we've got, this Brexit deal, is worth continuing in its current form, or do we dare to finesse it, to tweak it, to change it? Nobody wants to discuss it. This is the first person from the Labour side that I've heard speak with any energy about it. And I absolutely agree. This model is costing us about 4% of our GDP every single year. Add that to what's happened with COVID-19, which is another £300 billion bill. And then, of course, there's Ukraine. The Ukraine piece is concerning to me because it actually exposes just how volatile our own economy is to international headwinds, as indeed Brexit, indeed COVID as well. But we seem to ignore that and only focus from a domestic perspective. I've called for some time that we put effort into seeing those grain ships leave Odessa to get to international markets. Just a fifth of the grain is getting out. And we've now realizing very late in the day that Ukraine is the breadbasket for Europe and indeed beyond. Get that grain out, you help reduce the prices, it'll help the Ukrainian economy, it'll help Africa completely, but most importantly, it'll also help Europe, including the UK, tackle the cost of living crisis. And there is no plan to do
Ella,
any of
as
that.
the only Brexiteer on the panel, do you want to address that?
Please, yes. Lord save us. As the only representative of the majority of the Brexit
Well, I am
voting
too, but
public.
I can't get involved, obviously.
I don't want to rehash.
Tell us how's it going.
I don't want to rehash this, the Brexit argument. But what I will say is, it's pretty sick making the relish with which politicians enjoy looking, describing and rubbing our nose in how bad they say it's all going. I don't think any Brexiteer with two brain cells to rub together thinks genuinely that we're in a rosy, sunlit uplands, whatever it is.
Constructive change
And
as to where you would take
hang on
Brexit.
a minute,
That's
Tobias.
the question.
Hang on
That
a
is
minute,
the
Tobias.
question.
I haven't been in Westminster making the calls. I tell you, if I had, there'd be a lot of
You
things
just
that
said
were
you were a
different.
Brexiteer.
Yeah, but
we're
I
all
don't have any.
Brexiteers. We all are
Part of
living with Brexit.
Hang on.
I'm saying this model of Brexit is not working.
Hang
So
on.
tell us, how do we change it?
Let her speak.
I know. I'm used to Remainer shouting at me, and don't worry about
I'm not a Remainer.
But the-
I'm a
but the-
post-Brexiteer. We're all post-Brexiteers. The fact that you label
Tobias,
people...
let her speak, please.
But, the thing is, as I was saying, I don't think anyone thinks we're living in a one that I've just described how bad the cost of living crisis is. No one thinks that things are going well. The point is, I'm not sat in the House of Commons making policy or making law. Part of the Brexit vote, the excitement of it was giving more democracy to ordinary people, to your average Joe and Jane. And unfortunately, what this government has done, and with no help from the opposition from the sidelines, is make a complete hames of it, has made a total mess of any kind of potential that we could have had.
That was all-
by spending, hang on a minute, by spending, I know you can laugh
But it was always going to be the Brexiteers argument when it didn't work. Well, it could have worked if you'd done
If you'd
it
have done
properly.
that. So what would you do differently?
The scorn in this room is unbelievable.
No,
and actually, to be serious for a second,
I'm curious.
To be serious for a
You're
second,
not very curious because you won't let us speak.
the things that could have been differently is that you could have had politicians take seriously the exciting prospect of voting citizens wanting to be more involved in politics, looking at big things like sovereignty, big things like democracy, talking about how we could change British politics for the better. That take back control slogan might have been slandered as some kind of ridiculous Nigel Farage side of the bus, whatever it is. And you can go down that route if you want. Or actually, if you cared about, as you seem to opine like you do, about the average, person who, you say, oh, it's so bad, they're going to food banks, oh, it's so terrible, everyone's a hard time. If you actually cared about their political prospects and the future of their political lives, you would have taken seriously the challenge that Brexit set the British political class. Unfortunately, it has been squandered, and I'm miserable about that. But what I will not accept is that it's somehow our fault, that it's the fault of voters in Bolton or in Tottenham or all the places where there's...
Sorry,
nobody has said here for you to sit here. Hang on a minute.
Nobody has said that.
We
You are
accept the
putting
result.
words
For you-
into people's mouths
for you
then saying that they're our views and they are not. This is ridiculous.
For you to sit here and scoff and say,
I'm not scoffing. I want to know what you do better. I'm still asking this, but Ian's going to tell me to shut up again. I want to know what will change.
Anyway, let's move on.
I'm
going to tell you all to shut up because we have to go to the news.
Right.
It's 8:33 news headlines with Daryl Jackson.
The Scottish National Party's treasurer is stepping back from his role until a police investigation into the SNP's finances ends. Colin Beattie was arrested before being released without charge, pending further investigation. The Prime Minister says restoring power sharing in Northern Ireland is the right thing to do. Rishi Sunak's been speaking at a dinner alongside those who wrote the Good Friday Agreement to mark 25 years since the peace deal. And about 1,400 security officers at Heathrow Airport are going on strike again for 8 days next month. There's disruption and delays expected to passengers arriving for the King's coronation. LBC weather, a dry and largely clear night across the UK and feeling chillier with a low of 1.
This is LBC.
Rising.
Six with us on Cross Question, Dame Angela Eagle, Greg Dyke, Tobias Ellwood and Ella Whelan. Let's move on to a text question from Amber in Southwark, who says, how damaging is the voting system's lawsuit against Fox News for Rupert Murdoch? Well, in case you haven't kept up with this, Fox News have agreed to pay Dominion Voting Systems the equivalent of £634 million over how it reported on the 2020 US presidential election, including repeating Donald Trump's lies that company stole it from him. And it's a huge amount of money for any media organisation to pay out, no matter how powerful they are. Greg Dyke, let's come to you first.
I don't think it's about the money. I mean, Fox News makes a vast amount of money. I think the real issue is that it's been paid so that Rupert Murdoch and other executives and presenters at Fox News don't have to go into court and be exposed to what has already come out from the papers set out before the court, and that is that they quite blatantly lied, that they quite blatantly joined the campaign to say that the election had been stolen from Trump, when none of them believed it, and their own journalism didn't believe it. And they did it, if you read what Rupert Murdoch said, they did it not because they were blue or red, not because of the politics, but because they were green, in other words, dollars. And they were scared they were going to lose their audience to more extreme right-wing broadcasters. So they decided that they would... Because if you remember on the night of that election, Fox News behaved, I thought, pretty honourably and came out with the other broadcasters and wouldn't broadcast Trump's statements. Yep. They completely changed that position afterwards. And there's another company that makes voting machines that's also suing them for a much bigger figure. And I suspect they'll have to settle that because it's quite clear they don't want Rupert Murdoch or others to have to end up in court. But it's pretty cynical stuff. It shows they're quite happy to lie as long as it's in the interest of keeping their viewers.
This is a real problem because there is already this narrative out there that we're all at it, that everyone in the media, if you're in political broadcast or political print media, we do what our masters tell us to do. Now, I can sit here honestly and say in 13 years, no one's ever told me what to say or even tried to influence what I should say. But I might as well talk till I'm blue in the face because there will be people who say, but look at Fox News, journalists on there, they did what Murdoch told them to say, so you must do what your boss tells you to say.
Well, when I was running the BBC, the idea that I could have phoned up the newsroom and told them what to put out was a joke. I mean, the first thing, it would be leaked everywhere, and the second thing, they wouldn't put it out, and quite rightly.
But do you understand that for a lot of people out there, this is going to feed into this insidious narrative, isn't it?
Well, particularly in America.
Yeah.
Where the belief in that by and large the major networks are all liberal. I mean, it's a joke from the British perspective, but that they're all liberal.
And to be fair, they kind of are, apart from Fox and one or two fringe ones.
So.
Well, I don't know. I remember being in America at the time of the Iraq War, and if ever I've seen a bunch of from ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, they all picked up the flag and went to war. They all just went headlong. And actually, the reason the BBC did so well in America at that time was it balanced it. It tried to balance it. It seems to me, but I mean, Fox News has never attempted balance, but this is an extreme version of that. It basically says, although we don't believe it, we're going to say this is happening because it's in the interests of getting more viewers so that we get more money.
The interesting thing, Whelan, is that not that they sued Fox News, but they didn't sue Donald Trump, who was the instigator of all of this.
Yeah, well, I think your point that there is this feeling that that everybody is at it in the media is all pervasive. It's also kind of true in America to a certain extent. I was listening to an interview with someone from the Washington Post this morning who himself said, he said, actually, I mean, most of them are liberal, and there is a problem with Fox News. Obviously have got their issues in terms of proper journalism, and they're well known for that, and trying to step carefully so that I don't get sued. But if you look at the way in which the kind of Hunter Biden scandal with the leaked laptop files, the way in which the Capitol riots were reported on, which have, huge amounts of that reporting has now come to light to be the product of a sort of assertive journalists who are sort of frothing at the mouth to try and do anything they can to discredit Donald Trump. Not that it takes very much, but there was a definite kind of political bias there, and all of this, I think, feeds a very corrosive narrative among American public that the media cannot be trusted. Particularly, that plays into Trump's hands because that's a narrative, that's a kind of line that he has used time and time again. But it's hard to argue back against that when you have very sort of senior, serious members of the press in these supposedly well-credited papers and news sites doing things that are quite obviously politically biased and quite obviously have an agenda. And, I think that press freedom is one of the most is the bedrock of any kind of civilization. It should be absolute. I don't think that there should be any, whether it's bosses or politicians, having anything to do with what journalists can report. And there's too much law, particularly in this country, that goes against that.
Tobias.
Yeah, I mean, we've just had a robust debate where there was disagreement, and now I find myself in complete agreement. And that is very healthy politics and discussion in the media. Not so in the United States. I'm very concerned about where US is going as the lead nation from a Western perspective. It's now used as an exemplar by President Xi and indeed Putin to say that's why we don't do democracy, because it's become so polarized, so sensationalist and so divisive. You are almost obliged to choose one channel and live in an echo chamber and not hear the other points of views. And I am concerned a little bit that we could start to head down that way, that you only can end up getting promotion, indeed, in Parliament, if you actually support your party, if it stoops low, for example. I hope we can avoid going down that path, indeed. We need to remember that in the freedom of the press, there is a sense of responsibility and duty to make sure that you hear all sides of the argument, and they are aired absolutely fairly. Otherwise, particularly with social media as well, you take yourself into a very, very dangerous place.
Angela?
I think that this is about ensuring that those that purport to be those that are giving us our news tell the truth. And the issue here is that Fox News knew that the conspiracy theories about Dominion voting systems were rubbish, but they ran with them because they didn't want to lose the people that were watching, who were believing what Trump said. And so what they then did was reinforce something that they knew was a lie, that was a dangerous lie that could have led to political unrest, that did lead to the 6th of January riot that nearly upended the US Constitution.
I wonder how many of the people that indulged in this at Fox News have still got their jobs. I suspect all of them.
Exactly. And the thing is that what we need to do is deal with the conspiracism that has come with the rise of social media, which allows people to propagate, and sometimes hostile state actors, to propagate vile, untrue propaganda that isn't truth. There can be no democracy if we lose sight of what's true and what's false. And our news media, they can have their biases, they can have all of that, but we have to trust in truth or democracy will not survive.
Daniel in Chesterfield has texted this. The chairman sorting out loans for Boris, Gary Lineker fiasco, licence fee woes, sackings across the news division. Is the BBC in its dying days, Greg Dyke?
I don't think it's in dying days. I don't think it's in a healthy state at the moment. I think this is what happens when you have a government, a particular, a one-sided government attacking it, as they have been attacking it for a long period of time, and particularly financially attacking it. But the BBC it's one of its greatest assets is survival.
Like the monarchy.
Yeah, like the monarchy.
Resilient.
The BBC. I think one of the problems for the BBC is the decline in the younger audience, and that at some stage it's going to have to try to look at how it does it, because otherwise the audience are disproportionately over 50, over 60, and it's a real issue. But that's not just the BBC, that's all traditional broadcasters. Yeah. And if you go back to the discussion we were just having, we've always required broadcasters to balance, to have impartiality. If you've got a generation who aren't even listening to or watching those broadcasters, you've got a problem. Yeah. In democracy terms.
Anyone else want to?
Well, I'm just going to add about the BBC because, again, from the international security perspective, the work that the BBC and indeed others do in providing a sense of, I think, of truth, of speaking, providing reports on what is going on across the world has been so, I think, important as a messaging. And I'm really saddened to see our government cut back on supporting the international, the world service, particularly as if we want to keep sight of the truth with all the changes that are taking place, this sort of dark chapter that we're sliding towards internationally. The work of the BBC has been absolutely paramount. I'm sorry to see that slip.
And for example, the populists, of which Trump was certainly one, and there are many others still in power, can use the capacity of social media and deep fakes and all of the things that are coming along the line to hide truth to such an extent that it's going to be very difficult soon, if we don't do something about it as democracies, to ensure that people can distinguish between facts and fiction. And without that, you don't have any basis for any kind of discussion or decision making.
Very quickly, I do think we need to think about what we're going to do about it. Unfortunately, at the moment, all we're doing is censoring. And if you're looking at how to try and prevent conspiracy theories from flourishing, conspiracy theories, particularly in America, are a real scourge to the health of politics. It's not by clamping down on free speech. In fact, actually, by allowing more open public debate, you allow the disinfectant of sunlight to fall upon the sort of things that Fox News reports on. Unfortunately, it feels like every single politician now wants to ban anything they think is bad.
But the sunlight is this court case.
Okay, Angela, we have to move on. Thank you for all of your answers for that. We'll move on in just a moment. It's 8:48.
LBC.
Nine on LBC, Dame Angela Eagle, Greg Dyke, Tobias Ellwood and Ella Whelan with us answering your questions. Right, a caller, John in Brighton. John, what would you like to ask?
Hello, panel. Yeah.
Hello.
Following the comments by the Greater Manchester Police Chief Constable on LBC this morning, when is the witch hunt against the police going to end?
Now, Stephen Watson insisted to Nick Ferrari that no police force across the country is institutionally racist, despite Baroness Louise Casey's recent report into the Met concluding that it is. Angela.
Well, I mean, clearly there are significant problems in the police around these areas, whether it's racism, whether it's other biases. Louise Casey's report mentioned homophobia. If you look at how the Met Police dealt with the Stephen Port case, also mentioned misogyny. We've seen what happened with the terrible aftermath of the Sarah Everard murder. There are clearly very, very bad people that have been allowed to not only enter but flourish in the police. And so it's really, really important that the police forces sort themselves out, and if they don't, the government takes much greater responsibility to do so, because in the UK, policing is by consent, and that means that as a public we consent to the police having that force over us, but we expect them to treat everybody fairly. And so it's really, really important that we acknowledge that there are structural, institutional problems. I don't have a problem with labelling one way or the other. I want it sorted out.
Do you believe that Merseyside Police, where you're based, is institutionally racist?
Well, look, that's what I've just said. I want the Merseyside Police to deal with everybody they come across fairly and treat them equally, not because of the colour of their skin,
but
not because of their gender. I think that there are obviously cases where they don't, but that doesn't mean that all of them are a problem. And there are obviously cultures that get set up, and that there are instances, we know with some of the disciplinary things that are coming along in the Met now, where people are in WhatsApp groups where they trade the most awful views about women or black people, people with disabilities, and gay people, and that has to be stamped out. That doesn't mean that people who join the police aren't in it, the vast majority of them, for a good reason, doing good, very, very dedicated public service. But in order to enable them to do their jobs properly, you have to stamp out these kinds of attitudes and approaches, and that has to be done across the police in all police forces.
Tobias.
I mean, I've huge respect for what the police do for different reasons. I've worked very closely with them, and any police officer, leaves their house, puts the uniform on, says goodbye to their loved ones, leaves the house, not knowing how their day will unfold. And it's a good day if they can go back to their family and nothing extreme has happened. But as we know, that often isn't the case. So we give huge thanks to what they do.
But John thinks there's a witch hunt against the police going on at the moment.
There's no doubt, because of the high-profile events that Angela has just been outlining, and we've been discussing, that of course there's going to be the microscope is going to be placed on how they operate. There are questions to be asked about the vetting process as to make sure that not just initially as they're recruited, but also the constant evaluation that goes on. Every police officer should occasionally be reminded of the standards and values that they're obliged to uphold. There's a structural element of this as well. I did a study on this when I first became an MP. 43 different constabularies, all operating quite independently, if you like. If you compare it with the army, you have different regiments that have county connections and so forth, but you have one head of the army, and then you have a process aboard that makes sure the discipline is managed right across the frame. So maybe that there are areas that we can look at to improve how we actually operate to avoid these sort of things happening in the future.
Greg Dyke.
I suspect they've let too many people into the police force who basically were inclined to be racist, sexist. And I think you've got to stop that, and you probably got to go back and re-interview all sorts of people. You may have to pay certain people off to leave because they've got the wrong sort of attitudes. I think you read all the recent events, and they are pretty scary. Having said all that, I suspect there are also some very good people in the police force who've done very well. I remember going along years ago when I was at the BBC, I invited John Stephen, who was then running the Met, to come along and talk to our management team, and then he invited me back to talk to his. Now, he was very clear about racism, about sexism, homophobia. He was very clear to his people, but his people were the senior people. What's happening down below? What's happening down there? And we've seen some of that, and that's pretty scary. And I think you've got to look again at who gets in the police force and ask them very serious questions about their attitudes to life.
Okay, Ella?
Well, like Angela, I don't think there's any great merit in playing around with labels. In fact, actually listening to the radio this morning, Doreen Lawrence was talking about how she's just bored of having the kind of discussion about whether it's institutional or not, who's going to admit it's institutional or not, because it quite clearly doesn't change anything. I think, the thing I think we need to question is why it is that members of the police force don't seem to believe in the idea of public service anymore, because if out of sacrifice and public service, there's a lot of, as been mentioned, I'm sure there's lots of good police officers, but genuinely there seems to be, even within, I think this is part of the problem, a lack of confidence within the police. Whether that's because there's a witch hunt, I'm not sure, but you have at the moment police officers being asked to do everything from arrest people off Twitter, to stand outside supermarkets holding up "this is offensive" signs, to then, it's no wonder that they don't have time to answer women when they get raped, to follow follow up on burglaries, to do all the things that police are supposed to do. So I think we just need to have a kind of wholesale, holistic reassessment of what we actually think the police should be involved in, what aspects of public life the police should be involved in, and more importantly, what aspects they should not.
Thank you very much for that call, John. Our final question comes from Susie in Leicester. After losing the infamous Wagatha Christie lawsuit to Colleen Rooney, Rebecca Vardy has now trademarked that name for the entire row and will probably make a fair bit of cash out of it. Which popular phrase would you like to, and I can't read the screen, if someone could scroll it up a bit, please. Which popular phrase would you like to trademark and make some dough out of? Please not Brexit means Brexit. We'll leave that one for Theresa May, shall we? Angela.
I can't think of a popular phrase. You were going to ask.
Yeah.
You were going to ask when we've snatched victory from the jaws of defeat.
Yeah, that seems to have been deleted off the original text.
But I had decided that the victory that I snatched from the jaws of defeat happened on a chessboard, because I was a chess player.
You're quite a good chess player.
And there were many times when I was facing defeat and I managed to snatch victory. And the phrase I always used as I won was checkmate.
I don't think you'll be allowed to trademark that one. Tobias?
No, I'm going to go for the second question rather than the first one. I enjoyed that chess game that we played in against the House of Lords too. I was requested by my little boy, who's obsessed with Lego, to buy.
So was I.
And still are.
55 years ago.
And to buy the Big Ben, to the Elizabeth Tower, as it's now called. And I didn't buy it when I was on a trip to the United States. I think that was where it was on sale then. It wasn't on sale here for some reason. So I went home and with my older son, we built a Elizabeth Tower out of paper mache, which was 3 foot high, and so. We managed to gain victory out of defeat because my younger son absolutely loved it, more so than the 9-inch little model.
A slightly briefer answer from Ella, please.
I have a not a trademark, but a motto, and I hope we could make some dough out of it. That's free speech allowed. It's the motto of the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is taking place on the 28th and 29th of October this year. Get your tickets.
OK, Greg?
Well, I'm a big Brentford fan, and we're living through the best
living a dream
we've ever. Yes, living a dream. I mean, I remember going I was chairman for 6 years when we were.
Timing is everything, Greg.
I know. I was there at the wrong time. Except it's much better as a fan than it was as a chairman when you had to have a whip round to pay the wages that month. And there was always a pretty nasty stuff about Brentford, talking about it was only on a bus stop to Hounslow. But so I'm going to have up the bees as my... I'll take that.
I don't think you'll be allowed that one either. I have no contribution to make to this question. Thank you all very much indeed for coming on the programme tonight. Tobias Ellwood, Dame Angela Eagle, Ella Whelan and Greg Dyke. Coming up in the next hour, we're going to talk about diabetes. Not because I personally am a type 2 diabetic, although I am. And tomorrow, I've got to have laser treatment on one of my eyes because of my diabetes. So I was very interested in this story today, which says that going on a radical soup and shake diet can permanently reverse type 2 diabetes. Newcastle University have been doing a study into this. Patients who stuck to an 800 calorie a day diet for 3 months, then kept off the weight, were free from symptoms 5 years later and no longer needed medication. Well, I'm seriously thinking about doing this. The trouble is, there's only about a couple of flavours of soup that I like, and I don't like shakes. But if it can reverse my diabetes, why wouldn't I? Are you thinking about it too?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the SNP's Treasurer Colin Beattie has quit his role as police investigate the party's finances. Mr Beattie was released by police yesterday after being arrested as part of the investigation. Anna Sarwar is leader of the Scottish Labour Party.
It was absolutely right for Colin Beattie to resign, but he should have been sacked. And I think it demonstrates a lack of leadership.